Viktor Orbán is behind a lot of what's happening around Europe in politics today. I thought I would briefly talk about what his ideology is and what this basically a guidebook to authoritarianism is. The same kind of guidebook has been followed by others, latest recently Donald Trump, but also to some degree Vladimir Putin in Russia. So this is Soup of the Week. My name is Pekka Kallioniemi, and I'm going to talk about illiberalism. So what is illiberalism? Illiberal democracy is a seeming democracy that's in a country, but it's not really democracy. So there's a lot of limitations to citizens, and it's very difficult to go back to liberal democracy from illiberal democracy. So how this works, let me explain. So this is actually a very good study paper or white paper called Illiberal Democracy in Hungary, the Social Background and Practical Steps of Building an Illiberal State. It goes through all the basic steps, but I'll briefly explain them to you today. As most of you know, since Orbán's rise to power, there has been a big surge in both corruption and poverty in Hungary. So today, Hungary is the poorest country in the EU, and it is also the most corrupt one. And how did this happen? There are many steps to it. So basically, once Orbán and his Fidesz party rose to power, they started doing several processes. Some of them were started even before this. So the first step, one of the first steps is usually media takeover. And if you look at any of these countries, former Soviet countries that now have some degree pro-Kremlin or fully pro-Kremlin leadership, you can see that media takeover had happened usually before. So any country in Belarus, media was very centralized. Even in Russia, there was a man called Sergei Kirienko and other like oligarchs who took ownership of big media houses, TV stations, radio stations, newspapers, later on social media also, of course. And this is pretty crucial because if you look at Ukraine, same thing happened there, and Hungary. In Hungary, a handful of Orbán's cronies took over most of the media, and basically after Orbán rose to power, the state funded a lot of these stations. So they bought airtime, they bought commercials, and a lot of those commercials were against the opposition, were against NGOs, George Soros mainly. They spread conspiracy theories, basically demonizing anybody who was against Viktor Orbán. So this is usually the first step. You try to get control of the media. And of course, it's also happening in the United States. So what's happening right now there, they cannot, the Trump administration cannot get control everything, or even though social media is pretty much in their control. Now, after the TikTok deal, they will basically control all social media in the United States. Well, not Trump directly, but people who support him. And they also have used a lot of intimidation tactics to more traditional media, and many companies, including ABC, have paid these settlement payments to or fines to Trump for whatever reason. It's basically if you said something bad about Trump at some point, he was disappointed, you pay up, and then you can continue because it's a bribe in a sense. But anyway, is media takeover one of the first steps. Second step would be taking over the judiciary system. So replace judges, recreate courts so that they are for you and not against you. So in the United States, for example, you try to get majority in the Supreme Court, which Trump basically now has, even though it isn't always going the way Trump would like to, but pretty much the MAGA Republicans can decide on legislation. and different like federal courts and so on, they try to replace and put their own loyalists in. This is exactly something. The same thing happened. It happened in Russia. It happened in Hungary. Of course, it happened in Belarus. It's now happening in Georgia. They tried to make it happen, of course, Ukraine, Moldova. But this is basically so once the court system is on your side, the judicial system is on your side, it's very easy to make new legislation, and it's easy to make these example court cases that then can be referred to in the future. It is much easier to persecute your enemies or perceived enemies. So this is usually the second step. Once you already have a little bit of power, you start taking over the judicial system. And then once you control those, some regimes or some leaders use force to get rid of opposition. So in some countries they are being imprisoned. In some countries they are exiled or they live on their own because they feel like they're being oppressed. In some countries they are being killed. In Navalny in Russia, Nemtsov. There's a lot of examples for this, especially from Russia. Just people get killed or imprisoned indefinitely for criticizing the regime. This is something that's also might happen in the United States in the near future. Not so much in Hungary. Hungary is in the EU, so they have a framework where they have to work on, but they use different strategies to. And basically, it's still you can criticize Orban in Hungary. It's not something you go jail to after you do that, but it's quite challenging. Let's put it that way. But they control the judicial system. They control the media, and after this, you try to rig the elections. So any future election should be easily winnable by your regime or your party or whatever. And this is something that Orban did pretty well, quite well. So they gerrymandered. Gerrymandering is when you draw the election maps again, redraw them so that you have more favorable result. So basically, if you see that there's a lot of support in certain region for, say, Viktor Orbán, you can divide it into two electoral regions, and then you can get 2 wins or something like this. This is a very simplified example, but gerrymandering is basically redrawing the electoral map, election map, so where people go to vote and so on. In some countries, there's a lot of foul play done with this. So, for example, in Moldova, Russians are organizing bus trips so that people will vote in multiple places. The same thing happened in Georgia in these smaller elections, municipal elections that we had. They had about a week ago. So a lot of this stuff also happening, and this more traditional, like you get paid cash to vote for a candidate in some regions where basically very poor regions. This usually happens in pro-Russian areas, for example, in Moldova. But yeah, this basically the whole system is very good for it's beneficial, very beneficial for people who are in charge. Viktor Orbán, Vladimir Putin, to some degree Donald Trump, they become extremely rich. They can accumulate wealth. They can get money from state projects, infrastructure projects. Usually they don't really make themselves wealthy on paper because that would look bad. But they give, for example, their brother starts a company, and this brother's company then gets a big infrastructure project, say a train from Budapest to Belgrade, for example. Just an example, but how it could work. But usually these authoritarian leaders, they give their wealth, they transfer their wealth to people that they trust, family, spouses, friends, and so on, so that they can kind of mask where the money actually went. It would look bad if you take it for yourself. So you just use people close to you. You create a network of cronies or oligarchs who help you kind of accumulate wealth. And what happens when you accumulate wealth? This is Viktor Yanukovych's mansion before. This is where he lived before he fled. A lot of this money came from, well, of course, Russia. But after he fled, it was there was just some random guy who took the keys and made it into a museum. So today you can actually visit. It's a museum. And there's some absurd stuff there, like this golden bread. That's that was found there. It's just what's golden bread, and it's kind of says a lot about the personalities of these wannabe dictators. They live in a completely different reality. But there was recently a good story on how Orban has this very big estate, private estate. It's not under his name, of course, but he allegedly lives there. And there's a Palm Garden private zoo. For some reason, dictators or wannabe dictators are interested in zoos with exotic animals. I don't know what this is about. It could be something to do with the brain chemistry. I don't know, but they like the zoos and exotic animals. But yeah, this is how they accumulate wealth. But the problem with this is that Hungary is still part of the EU and it still has elections, and it's easy to rig elections to some degree, to some point, but after a while, if you are not in total control of the system, you might actually lose. So this is what's happening to Orban's party. So you can see Orban's party still in 2022 was around, they had around plus 55% support, almost 2/3. But then gradually it's been going down because, well, Hungary is becoming poorer, it's becoming more corrupt, and people are kind of fed up. The only problem with Hungary before this was that there wasn't really a competition for Orban. But now there's another populist leader, Peter Magyar, who leads the TISA party, that you can see that's now it's going, their popularity has surpassed Orban's Fidesz. So it's going to be a very tough election, I think, next year when Orban might actually lose power. Let's see. It depends. They'll probably pull up every trick from their sleeves to kind of, gerrymandering all this, basically cheat their way to stay in power. And Russia is, of course, going to be a massive power behind Orban, and probably to some degree Donald Trump too. He will kind of promote Orban's ideologies and politics. But a lot of this, the idea, it's not new, but this idea of staying to some degree a liberal democracy, but still bringing this illiberal factor, it's very Orban-like, and it's Orban has kind of pioneered a lot of this. And there's a good article on the Atlantic, or the path to autocracy. So how Trump will try to use some of these, some of the stuff that Orban has done, he will try to do it in the United States. The thing with the United States is that there's a lot of checks and balances. There can be a lot of pushback, but so far Trump has been relatively successful in this road to illiberalism. Again, of course, Georgia is another example. Ivanishvili is basically he's not directly in politics, but there's a party called Georgian Dream, where Ivanishvili has a lot of influence. He's basically the leader of the country right now, and leads the illiberal movement that is actually very aggressive. So they use a lot of force against protesters. There has been protests for over 300 days. So every day there's a protest in Tbilisi, Georgia. Police and the titushki, so the called thugs, street thugs, Kremlin thugs are becoming more and more aggressive. Almost all opposition politicians are just there in prison right now. They are either left the country or they are in prison. So they are not even like trying to hide it anymore. They're just, everything is out in the open. Georgia is in a very bad place right now, and they were supposed to have this big demonstration that kind of fell flat. But I'm sure they'll continue their demonstrations. Well, they actually did. There's also one today. One of the more successful ones, of course, Euromaidan. This is where Ukrainian citizens, they decided that it's enough. We want to be with the West, with the liberal democratic West, rather than autocratic Russia, basically. And we saw the force of the people after Euromaidan. Yanukovych fled via Crimea to Russia, and Putin lost Ukraine after that. So, and of course, they annexed Crimea and started the war in the east, but they lost the minds, the Ukrainian minds, the minds and spirit of Ukrainians. They lost. So this was actually a big turning point, probably the biggest turning point, 21st century, geopolitically. And of course, there's also in Ukraine, there were, besides Yanukovych, there were figures who were working for the Kremlin. One of them was Viktor Medvedchuk. He owned a lot of media. He's an oligarch, Ukrainian oligarch, who owned a lot of media in Ukraine. And basically his message was very pro-Kremlin. All his media, TV channels and so on were parroting Kremlin narratives. He was, I think his importance is shown when after he was exchanged to over 100 Azov fighters who defended Mariupol. Basically, these are, for Putin, they are the most kind of valuable prisoners of war, and he was ready to give up over 100 of them for Medvedchuk. So Medvedchuk is now in Russia, and he was on hold. He was like waiting after February 2022. Like it was supposed to be a very quick takeover of Kyiv, and he would then become an interim leader of Ukraine. But that never happened, of course, and nobody really liked Medvedchuk in Ukraine. He's just had a lot of money and power. He was not he was in politics, but he was never a very liked politician. And then what's going on in Moldova? Of course, Russia spent at least 100 million euros on interfering with the elections. But it was a very important election for them. Fortunately, the pro-EU bloc led by Mayu, so PAS is the party. So fortunately they won, but there is a Reason to Be Square investigation that concluded that they did a massive campaign, for example, on TikTok, with some videos had a lot of views. In total, there were over 90 million views on these videos, some of them deep fake, AI-generated fake news content, disinformation. They even paid priests, Orthodox priests, to promote Kremlin viewpoints. Yeah, they still lost. There was some countermeasures done by the pro-EU government, but also it seems like Moldovan people do not want to go back to this kind of Soviet system again. And of course, Romania. So there was a lot of manipulation going on in the first round of the presidential elections in Romania when Călin Ceausescu was the candidate. He was also supported by another Romanian party as a protest, so that they didn't want other candidates to go through, so they supported Ceausescu. But there was also interference coming from Russia, and this was concluded by a report by Dance, the owner of TikTok. So TikTok is an essential tool in election interference and manipulation today. Still, nobody has really found a good counter other than media literacy for this kind of election interference. And it's not just Eastern Europe. In France, there is Vincent Bollor, I don't know how to pronounce the name, something like that. He basically has been spreading pro-Kremlin narratives. He owns a lot of media in France. Today, populist far-right party AfD is the biggest party in Germany. They are supported heavily by the richest man in the world, Elon Musk. And yeah, I also already mentioned Sergei Kiriyenko in the beginning. He's basically taking control of the disinformation machinery in Russia, and he was responsible for most of the interference and manipulation that took place in Moldova. But that didn't really work. So let's see where Kiriyenko goes in the near future. Is it will he have his last cup of tea, or fall out of a very high building? But basically, this is 101 illiberalism, road to illiberalism. Orban is offering the blueprint for many countries. Slovakia, of course, should be mentioned here. Robert Fico's Slovakia. Let's see what happens in Czechia, another potential target for this kind of politics and meddling. But this was Soup of the Week. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, comment, all that. If you have any questions, please send them to me. And see you next time.